Creepshow, released in 1982, directed by George Romero and written by Stephen King. Now, what better collaboration can you think of than George Romero and Stephen King if you're a horror fan? So, this is another anthology horror, again, my favourite genre, and it's one of my favourite ones. I think often the anthology horror genre is overshadowed by the Amicus series of anthology horror films, and those were British films. I did a video on it if you want to check that out. But there have been some fantastic American anthology horror films out there as well, and Creepshow is definitely one of them. In some ways, I think Creepshow may even be the most famous anthology horror film out there. Now, it's based around the idea of the old EC comics that you used to get in the 1950s, where there would be a host, like a crypt keeper or something like that, and like Tales from the Crypt, and they would introduce a story in comic form. And this film very heavily and deliberately pays tribute to that. The film has a wraparound story. The wraparound story is about a kid who, his father is a bit overbearing and discovers that he's got this Creepshow comic with all these stories in it, and he says it's garbage and shouts and swears at him and throws it out. And when he throws it out in the garbage, I think what they call the creep, this sort of undead creature comes to the boy's window and starts going through each of the stories with him, and we then see the stories play out. And it's probably more overtly inspired by those sorts of comics than any other anthology horror film, because in a lot of ways all of them, not all of them, but a great many of them have been inspired by those American comic books. But here we see parts of the story turned into animation, the stories turned into the frames from comics, and we also see really stark colour background. Some people don't like that. There's moments of sort of with like the end of different stories where we see a character and the background is like a really vivid bright colour, and a lot of people don't like that. They think it seems a bit cheesy, but I think it totally fits. Now, the film is very tongue-in-cheek, it's not meant to be taken seriously, and you really get the feeling that the people who worked on this film, Tom Savini also worked on it, did the makeup effects and special effects, and you really get the feeling that they had an absolute blast making it. Now, the stories that are in it, the first story is, I think the first one is Father's Day, and it's a story about a man who was killed by his daughter 10 years previous, and although he comes across as a bit of an arse, to be honest, he comes back. He was killed on Father's Day, and he comes back, I think it's like 10 years to the day or something like that, and he comes back and starts wiping out parts of his family. I think this is actually the weakest story in the film, which is unusual for an anthology horror film. Normally they don't start with the weakest story, but I think this is. There's no real great revelation about it. There's a really funny sort of setup to the story. You've got like Ed Harris, who was doing a favour, I think, to George Romero at the time, has a small part in it and shows off some ridiculous dance moves. But I still like it. I think when the lights go out in the house and the characters are going into the kitchen area, I think it's really creepy. So after that, I'm trying to think what you have next. I might get the order wrong. I think it's a story about starring Ted Danson and oh no, in fact, is it saying on the back of this? This is how I do all my reviews. I get all the information from the blurb. I haven't even seen them. No, Right, I think the next one's actually the Meteor story, which is interestingly it stars Stephen King in the role, and this one is like the most outlandish of all the stories, and it's the comic story. Like I mentioned in another video about how Dead of Night started that idea where you have one comedic story, and in this story Stephen King plays this sort of country bumpkin who lives on a farm on his own, and a meteor lands in the back of it, and he touches the meteor, burns his fingers, and it starts a growth on his hands, and it starts taking over his whole body, and we get to see loads of his, because he lives on his own. He's rather delusional. We get to see his fantasies in his head as the story plays out, and some of them are really quite funny. Again, some people don't like this story because they feel it's like too hokey, and too much in the jokes, too much in your face. But I love it. I think it's really, really clever, and I think it's really poignant at the end. And I think Stephen King did a brilliant job. He should have done more acting. Anyway, so you've got that. Then you've got the episode. The story where Ted Danson is a character who gets visited by a man called Leslie Nielsen. Now, Ted Danson's been having an affair with Leslie Nielsen's wife, and Ted Danson at gunpoint takes Leslie Nielsen takes Ted Danson at gunpoint to a beach, and he buries him up to his head, and it's about the tide coming in and whether he will survive, whether he'll be able to escape, because he'll have 1 second when the water dips in where he might be able to free himself, and it's all about whether he will. And it's a sort of revenge story. Leslie Nielsen's excellent in it, really excellent in it. Shows that he really could play a bad guy. And there's some great makeup effects in this one as well. I loved them, thought they were brilliant. Ted Danson's excellent in it as well. And then we've got my personal favourite, I think it's the best story, which is stars Hal Holbrook and Adrienne Barbeau, and it's about an academic who finds a crate that was brought to this university 100 years previous, and it has written on it that it comes from, I think it's like Nepal or somewhere like that, but it's somewhere remote. And when he opens it up, he finds that there's a creature living inside it, and it ends up killing a few people. But it's really it's definitely the scariest. It's also in some ways, even though it's not overly comedic compared to the Meteor story, it's very, very funny, because Hal Holbrook plays a character who keeps fantasising about killing his overbearing wife, Adrienne Barbeau, and Adrienne Barbeau is fantastic in this. I think she said it's her favourite role, and she's really great in it. But the monster in the crate is really creepy, and the ending of it always really freaked me out when I was a kid. And the last story is about a sort of Howard Hughes type character who lives inside this sealed apartment building, and he's like a Scrooge type character. He's a miser, he's stingy at people, he's horrible to people, and he's got this thing where he's completely afraid of germs, obsessive compulsive disorder. And what happens is eventually what happens is all these cockroaches come through everything in his house, and that's quite disgusting as well. But all in all the stories are really strong. I think Father's Day is the weakest, but it's an absolute hoot. It's just a riot, and if you can get this DVD as well as a fantastic documentary about the whole making of the film. I wish this had been a series of films. I know they made Creepshow 2 and there's Creepshow 3 as well. But really, I think it's Tales from the Dark Side is really the sort of spiritual sequel to this film. I hope they make another one. There's talk of it with George Romero and Stephen King. But anyway, check it out. Creepshow 1982. Fantastic American anthology horror film.